Godshards, The Weeping Grove by Peter Capozzi. Narrated by Hal and Peter Capozzi. The trees were crying. Haley could hear them now. That meant she was close. The young Godshard was nervous. She had never done anything like this before. She wasn't powerful, not like her mentor, Abraham. What could she do if the rumors were true? She slowly and cautiously approached the tree line, a mile from the road. The air was heavy, cold, and wet, almost in defiance of the warm, dry summer day. Summer evenings were cool, but they weren't this frigid. Haley tensed as she adjusted her gray robes. She always felt fidgety when she was nervous, and the robes felt more like a detriment now. Steeling herself, she entered the forest, and trouble came almost immediately. She saw the fungus. It all began when she came upon the town of Exopolis. She was supposed to discuss a grave matter with a fellow Godshard named Isaiah. Adamite Godshards usually worked alone, and Isaiah was typically brash, cocky, and outspoken. Their teacher, Abraham, could never quite rein him in. When their apprenticeship was completed, she and Isaiah went their separate ways. Godshards wandered the lands, helping people with their magical abilities and their words. Such was their purpose. A piece of their fallen god entered them, and thus they were chosen. The latest generation in a lineage of heroes that spanned 12 centuries. Haley had only been 3 days old when a shard chose her. Isaiah had been 18, a strange outlier among Godshards. Haley suspected that was why he was so abrasive at times. The older someone is when they receive a shard, the more their original personality clashes with their new nature. She was always the less powerful of the two. Her magic leaned toward botany and was nothing special. Isaiah's magic, on the other hand, was one of temperature and magnetism, and his shard was larger. Abraham always told them it was not just about the shard size. Their teacher was wiser and older with a shard greater than either of them. However, Haley never believed him, and Isaiah didn't either. Abraham's spells were grandiose and awe-inspiring, and it was obvious to both of them that the size of one shard played a huge part. As a result, Isaiah loved rubbing his superiority in her face. Every time he did a spell and she couldn't, he would give her an insufferable grin with a twinkle in his glowing eyes. But all of that was in the past, and she was happy she'd never have to see him again, or so she thought. Despite her misgivings, she heard he was at least staying true to the Adamite teachings. Perhaps he had matured after striking out on his own? She heard stories of good deeds and works, much in the spirit of the Godshards of old. There's a saying that if Adam, the first Godshard, could look upon your works and smile, you're on the right path. They were called Adamites for a reason, after all, and they all inspired to live up to his name. If what she heard was true, then Isaiah passed that test. Perhaps it was because of such tidings she was willing to let bygones be bygones when she received a letter from him. She was carving wooden trinkets for a new school in the village of Ashia. Haley loved helping the children, and the task kept her in the village for several weeks. The teacher nearly startled her when he gave her the letter. It was laced with the usual snark and some misguided ribbing on his part, but there was a genuine problem he needed help with. There were rumors of something strange happening to the trees outside the town of Exopolis. There was a lack of game in the adjacent woodlands and even reports of people going missing. He wanted help from someone who knew more about the realm of flora and logically believed she could help. She sent a reply saying she would arrive as soon as she could. She was on the edge of the Triad, so it would be about a week's journey to Exopolis. Unfortunately, inclement weather slowed her down, and nearly half a week more passed before she arrived. Perhaps it wasn't surprising then that she couldn't find him in Exopolis. He said to meet him at the plaza in the center of town. It was a modest dwelling on the edge of the League of Strength, a great alliance of city-states in the eastern half of Secundus. People bustled to and fro, although it was noticeably emptier than it had been in years past. The few people around appeared scared and wary. The green terracotta tiles were faded, and the stalls were empty. There was less color, less joy, like a looming shadow had enveloped them. Even the majestic statue of Leonidas, a legendary hero of ancient times, looked sad and droopy in the dimming light. Haley asked around about Isaiah to little avail. A market shop owner claimed to have seen him days earlier, and a couple of the city guards, steel-eyed hoplites with bronzed shields and tall-plumed helms, said he was waiting for someone in the plaza just the previous day. Haley cursed to herself. Was Isaiah still reckless and impatient even after all this time? Was one more day too much to ask? With little else to do and her only companion's confusion and frustration, she left town. However, as dusk graced the land, the sound of something strange came to her in the wind. Crying. The wails of souls, essence twisting in agony. She glanced around, desperate to find the source. Nothing stood out to her. Calming herself, she took a deep breath and changed tactics. Maybe her soul sight could help. It was a special vision that could read vibes and essences. Everyone had their own vibe, a soul fire. A lot could be revealed about a person to her via one glance. She closed her eyes and looked around once more. The various soul fires of the people of the town were uneasy, but that made sense given the rumors. So it's not coming from Exopolis then. Haley's heart sank as she turned to the distant tree line. It was the trees. Something was tormenting these trees. Haley's bond with nature was strong. Her spellcraft wasn't great, but her connection was peerless. Every root, every tree, every shrub had a personality, an aura all of their own. Her gift expanded even beyond botany to other organisms like fungi. Even basal things such as these had their own rhythm. It was one of her joys in life. Never had she seen trees in so much pain. She looked at her hands. She didn't know what could cause such agony, and she didn't know what strength was in her, but she had to try. Godshards never let injustices go unanswered. What would Abraham say? What would Adam say? She would not be found wanting. Haley sucked in a breath through her teeth as she came across the blight. It was unlike any fungus she'd ever seen. It was blacker than black, and it was wrapped around the trees like a constricting snake. The weirdest of all was it had no essence at all. A distinct wrongness emanated from it, but it was invisible to her soul sight. The trees, on the other hand, were crying out in anguish. Haley frowned. She had to liberate them from this strange substance. Her glowing eyes brightened as she began to chant. The fungus was surrounded by glowing green energy. She had to be gentle. One wrong move and the fungus grip might tighten and cause the tree more agony. As she pulled at it, the fungus did something unexpected. It growled. A strange blackness, an unlight, pushed through her greenish glowing form, severing the connection violently. Haley would have cursed in frustration if she wasn't so baffled. This was not like any fungus she'd ever seen. Her eyes narrowed. She had to keep trying.
"Oh, Haley, still ineffectual as ever,"
said a voice with a familiar smugness that she loathed. Haley spun to face Isaiah, standing between two trees, still cloaked in shadow.
"That silly little spell won't save them."
Haley frowned. Something was wrong with him. His soul fire was different, altered. "Why didn't you meet me in town like you said?" She tried to hide her confusion and concern, but her voice still cracked all the same.
"I knew you'd find us regardless."
Haley tilted her head. "Us?" Isaiah stepped out from the shadows and Haley gasped. His gray cloak was tattered and moldy. He was covered in the mysterious black fungus. It had eaten through parts of his arms and back like acid, replacing the flesh with its own form. Haley shook as she circled him, the sight making her nauseous. Trails of the stuff crawled up his shoulders, twisting around his neck and burrowing deep into the back of his head, hollowing out the flesh and latching itself to his skull and brain. His eyes were gone, stuffed full of fungus and unlight. "By the gods, what happened to you?" shouted Haley.
"He is part of me now,"
intoned the being using Isaiah's body.
"He got too close to the fungus. He didn't even notice my youngest child latch onto him. He is a worthy vessel, stronger and more stable than a normal human could ever be."
Haley gulped. The nameless one. The monster of the void.
"It is Wargash to you, worm. If you must call me anything else, call me the Queen of the Void
Or the Dark Mother.
What happened to the others? Isaiah said people were going missing.
They weren't strong enough to endure my gifts, so I needed a new approach. My children must spread. These trees and this Godshard are just the beginning. As I ate his mind, I saw you. A Godshard with a gift for botany. It's not much, but it will suffice. Before the infection was complete, I influenced his actions slowly, convincing him to contact you.
Morgash raised an arm, dripping fungus. She strode forward.
You shall spread my gift across this forest using your spells.
Haley's eyes widened and she staggered back. Never! She turned to flee, only to see a carpet of fungus surrounding her. Isaiah! I know you're in there! This isn't you! Don't let this monster control you! Fight it!
He's already gone, you pathetic fool.
Morgash folded her arms.
I defeated him with contemptuous ease. Such is the fate of this world. If he couldn't stop me, what chance would you have? Your shard is far from impressive after all. Give in, and I will make this quick.
Haley muttered a spell and she floated into the air. I'm sorry, Isaiah. I have no choice. She chanted quickly, the words of the old tongue leaping off her lips. Vines latched onto Morgash with blazing speed. They tightened quickly. Her eyes narrowed, seemingly oblivious to the pain. With raspy croaks, Morgash cast a spell in reply, punctuating the incantation with a long exhale. The air warming and sizzling, turning into a stream of fire and plasma. Haley gasped and ducked. She could still feel the heat as she hit the ground hard. Her robes had caught fire and she rushed to get them off. Haley's vision blurred as she staggered to her feet. Morgash lumbered toward her, muttering another spell while reaching into the tattered remains of Isaiah's pockets. Fragments of iron, sharp as blades, shot toward her. She chanted a spell as an answer, and a long branch of a nearby tree swung around to protect her like a shield. Yet the metal was stronger, and the branch snapped off. Scattered pieces of metal struck her in the face, drawing blood. Haley shook her head. There was no way she could beat her. She had to flee and get help from Exopolis. With another string of chants, she levitated into the air once more. There was one more row of trees, and then she'd be in the clear.
You're not getting out of this so easily,
growled Morgash as she finished another incantation. The trees in front of Haley stiffened and turned bluish. A thin layer of ice grew around them before the wood shattered like broken glass. Haley screamed as the frozen splinters enveloped her, forcing her to the ground once more. Haley dug herself up from the pile, gasping for air. She was covered in gashes and cuts, and they throbbed ever so slightly in the cool air. She turned to see Morgash also pulling herself from the rubble. Haley's head tilted. Did she hit herself by accident? Her thoughts were viciously halted as her leg writhed in agony. Her face hit the dirt, spitting out grass as she turned to see her leg reddening and bleeding. She screamed in utter anguish as tiny flickers of iron were being drawn from her bones. Morgash raised an arm and Haley was slowly dragged to her.
One last chance, Haley.
Morgash's voice was much raspier than before, and her lips were smoldered.
We can do this the easy way or the painful way. You decide.
Embrace the Void's vessel or
Embrace unending torment.
Haley groaned in agony, but something gave her pause. Morgash's hands were cut up and oozing blood, probably from flinging the iron blades. Between that, the trees falling on her, and the smoke on her lips, that's when it hit her. Morgash doesn't have the skill to cast spells properly. Isaiah might have some, but Morgash is just using him as a puppet. She's just using raw power. She's casting the spells without grace or skill. She's sloppy and reckless. Does she even know how the spells work? Maybe Abraham was right after all. Haley needed to fight smarter. Steeling herself through the pain, she muttered her chants through gritted teeth. A trio of roots launched themselves from the ground, coiling around Morgash and blocking her face. Perfect. As expected, the roots melted into burning slag. Another temperature spell, no doubt. Morgash yelped and jumped away from the burning material as it seared her flesh and incinerated the fungus. Her lips and throat were seared. One more hit like that and she won't be able to speak, and she won't be able to cast spells. Haley gestured to a nearby tree, apologizing to it before reaching out with glowing green energy. The trunk was old and strong, and it was struggling to comply with her command. Making matters worse was Morgash, who had recovered. She tried casting a spell, but whatever incantations she was chanting were too garbled by her injuries, and flashes of blue light exited her body as the shard throbbed and crackled. Morgash roared like a feral beast in anger, and with the fungus carpeting her feet, she shambled closer. Haley shook her head. Smarter, not stronger. She switched targets. There were several long branches on that tree. They looked heavy and strong. It would suffice. With a final grunt, the biggest branch snapped free and shot towards Morgash like a javelin. It hit home, piercing her chest and upward into her throat. Blood went everywhere. Morgash fell to her knees. A feral scream of anger and frustration exited Isaiah's ruined throat before the unlight left his body. Haley's shard pulsed and she cringed in pain. She didn't have much more in her. She just inched away from the fungus as best as she could.
Haley.
Isaiah choked. Haley opened her eyes to see Isaiah, whimpering as he lay, dying.
I'm sorry.
It wasn't you, she said. It was Morgash.
I'm not just talking about tonight. I mean in general. I shouldn't have doubted you. I didn't understand what Abraham meant until now. Can you forgive me?
Haley looked upon him with pity. How could she not? It's all right. Be at peace. Let the great shepherd guide you home. With a relieved sigh, Isaiah stilled, his body collapsing onto the ground. A blue light shot out of his body and up into the sky. His shard would seek a new host now. Hopefully, one whose life would not end so terribly. Haley teared up. No one deserved what he went through. At least his suffering was over. She tried and failed to get to her feet. That spell did a number on her leg. She muttered a string of chants and the scattered bark warped into a cane, enabling Haley to get to her feet. She turned toward the grisly sight of dead trees, flesh, and fungus. She couldn't just leave it like this. The fungus would infect someone else. She was aware that flames could destroy it, and she knew but one fire spell. "Forgive me," she said to the nearby grass and trees before casting a fireball spell aimed right at the mess. The flames roared to life and the black fungus shrieked in reply. It was spilling to the adjacent grass as she feared. She had no choice. Plants would regrow eventually like they have done 1,000 times before. What mattered most was Morgash was defeated, at least for now. Haley had to keep learning, keep growing like a giant oak tree. With further practice, who knows what she could do? With a grunt and a limp, Haley left the cursed ground behind. Every step caused her to wince, even with the cane. She needed Abraham to examine her leg. He'd know what to do. He'd want to know what happened here in any case. She spared one final look behind her. The yellow blaze grew hungrily, engulfing the corrupted trees with ease. She expected the trees to be outraged or scared, but no, she could feel their relief. Their deaths were a mercy, just like it had been for Isaiah. By morning, the trees had stopped crying. The end.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I want to give a shout out once again to Hel for doing a phenomenal job. You should check out her socials. I'm going to link them in the description or in the comments depending on where you're hearing this. As well as to Mandy, who provided that gruesome, lovely artwork of Isaiah. And as for the other sound effects and stuff I used, you should be seeing the credits right now for this. So yeah, that is basically it. Happy Halloween, everyone. And if you guys want to see more stuff like this, let me know.